Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the Evidence Synthesis Ireland webinar series. This is our first webinar of 2021, and it is our pleasure to have a webinar on consumer involvement with a panel of people from Cochrane Consumer across the globe. I'll give a short introduction about who we are. So my name is Nikita Burke. I am the Programme Manager with Evidence Synthesis Ireland. We are Evidence Synthesis Capacity Building Centre, which includes Cochrane Ireland, and we're funded by the Health Research Board and the HSE R&D division of the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland. And we aim to build evidence synthesis knowledge, awareness and capacity on the island of Ireland. We're delighted to co-host today with PPI Ignite at NUI Galway, who work with researchers, the public and patients to ensure that the patient voice shapes health and social care research. We will be recording the webinar and it will be on our website later today. And if you have any questions, which we will have time for at the end, please type them into the Q&A section at the bottom. And if you have any questions or issues, just send me a message in the chat function. So our panel are online today. I'm going to briefly introduce Richard, who will introduce the researcher consumer presenter pairs who will share their stories about how they collaborated. So Richard is Cochrane Consumer's Engagement Officer, where he supports the involvement of healthcare consumers in Cochrane's research and governance, and they've over 1,700 volunteers across the world. He works with Cochrane authors and partnerships to support this involvement, including the new International Network for Patient and Public Involvement in Research, of which he was a founding member. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Nikita. And hello, everyone. It's really nice that you could join us today for what I hope is a really interesting, thought-provoking webinar. And we're particularly interested in your views and questions at the end. So very quickly, I'd like to introduce the panel that we have for you today, and I'm really excited to be co-presenting with these amazing people. In order of appearance, as you'll hear them today, Karen Morley will be presenting with Nick Meader. So Karen is a retired secondary school teacher, a volunteer for Cochrane's Consumer Network and with Cochrane's Common Mental Disorders Review Group. And Karen's contributed to Cochrane and research in a wide range of ways, including co-authoring our flagship Evidence Essentials learning resource, work with the Common Mental Disorders Group, Voice of Experience College, has blogged and is a peer reviewer. And she'll be presenting with Nick. Nick Meader works with the CRD in York, where I'm based too. And after several years of developing mental health guidelines for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, he's currently a senior editor with Cochrane Common Mental Disorders Review Group and a member of York's Technology Assessment Review Group. Then Maureen and Janet will be presenting together. Maureen has a long and illustrious history of collaboration in the healthcare system and in research. She's chair of Cochrane's Consumer Network Executive Group and involved in a number of ways with Cochrane projects and advisory groups. She's also a member of Comet's Poppy working group and involved in a wide range of things in Canada, including she's being the co-vice chair of the Ontario SPORE Support Unit for Patient Partner Working Group. And then last but certainly not least, we have Janet, who'll be presenting with Maureen. Janet is an assistant professor at the Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And Janet develops and evaluates shared decision-making tools and approaches to support client-centered care in partnership with the First Nations in Canada. She's also got a research interest in the way that research is conducted in partnerships. And so I'm delighted to welcome Janet to our panel as well. When we've finished, we'll be joined as well by Adele Murphy, who works for PPI Ignite, as we've heard. So briefly, what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about why we involve consumers in evidence synthesis, a little bit about the language that we use to describe that, because that's quite complex. I'm going to describe the active framework for stakeholder involvement in systematic reviews, which I think will be a useful way to think about the presentations that we hear. And so I'm delighted that we'll be hearing from consumers and researchers who collaborated to produce systematic reviews. And that's the heart of our presentation, actually, to hear about how people have actually set about doing that. And then we'll share with you a range of practical resources for consumers and researchers, because we have quite a lot. Cochrane has them, and for people who are interested in doing this more, there's help there for you. And then we'll finish, this is a vitally important part of our presentation today, with a Q&A at the end, about 15 minutes. And so please do submit your questions as we go along in the chat box. And we can pick out those questions at the end and try and answer as many of those as we can. And then, for those questions that we can't answer straight away, if you head on over to Twitter afterwards, we'll be there to continue the conversation. Use the hashtag #CochraneInvolve if you're going to do that, and be delighted to see you there on Twitter as well. So before we kick off properly, we've got 3 polls for you, which Nikita's going to launch now. The first one is, how do you identify yourself? The second is, where are you in the world? And the third one is, if you could describe your level of involvement experience. So here's the first question. How do you identify yourself? Are you a clinician, academic, a healthcare practitioner, a policy or decision maker? Are you a member of the public, or a patient, or a carer, a researcher, student, or something else? So if you could just click in there and tell us and each other who you are. That'll help us to present effectively. Wow, that's interesting. Nikita shared the results of that poll. So 61% of us are researchers, which is interesting, and the rest spread amongst the different groups. So thank you very much for sharing that. The second question is, where are you? So are you in Ireland, in the UK, the rest of Europe, excluding the UK? Are you in North America, South America, Australasia, Asia, or Africa? So here are the results that Nikita's very kindly sharing. So half of us are in Ireland, and a third in the UK, and then the rest spread pretty much around the world, which is quite interesting. No one from Australasia, not surprisingly. It's in the middle of the night there at the moment. So thank you very much for that. And then the final question: how experienced are you in involvement? Are you a novice? You have some knowledge, but you've perhaps not put that into practice yet. Are you more knowledgeable and experienced? Have you got significant knowledge and experience? Thank you. So that's interesting. We've quite a widespread range of experience here. The most common is that people have some knowledge and experience, but we have everything from people who are novices, who know about it, haven't tried it yet. So that helps as well with presenting. I think there'll be something for everyone in here. I hope there is. So thank you very much. So I'll move on with the presentation. So since there are some novices here, I think people may not only be novices in terms of involvement, perhaps also even new to evidence synthesis. And so we wanted just to share something at the beginning, which introduces the idea of evidence synthesis, what it is. So evidence synthesis is also sometimes called systematic review, and it's a way of taking information from a range of studies that have sought to answer the same question to come to an overall understanding of what all of those different pieces of research found. And in that way, that helps people, and in this case, perhaps patients, to have an understanding about how effective a particular intervention is. And I've also shared a hierarchy, I suppose. This pyramid here is a hierarchy of evidence, with systematic reviews commonly regarded as being at the very top of the evidence pyramid. If you want to find out more, there's lots of information available for you, but there's this rather excellent Cochrane Ireland video. I've put the link in there, which does explain what evidence synthesis is to a general audience. I'm just going to touch on the language of engagement because this is an interesting area. We've put up a slide here which talks about the tangled terminology, as my colleague Annie Sinnott put it, who produced this slide. And here are just some examples of the kinds of language that people use when describing and talking about engagement and involvement. There's so many different ways of describing it. That in itself is interesting, the fact that there's lots of different language. It's also problematic to a degree because it's hard to talk about something if you don't have a shared language. And also these things people have very strong opinions about. And so it's just worth bearing in mind that the language is complex and that sometimes we need to be quite precise about that. But for today's webinar, I'm certainly going to be talking about involvement in research. And this is a definition from the NIHR Involve here in the UK, where I am. And they describe involvement as research being carried out with or by members of the public, rather than to, about, or for them. So not as the subjects of research, but as people who are partners in undertaking that research. Other words are available, including engagement, which is common in Canada, as Morley will point out. And then again, you know, there's a lot of discussion, strongly held beliefs about the word consumers. And today, we're going to be talking about consumers as users of systematic review evidence, as decision makers. And they can also be involved in the production and the sharing of evidence as authors and as peer reviewers. They can be members of the Cochrane Consumer Network, and we have a very large network across 79 countries of people who have an interest in evidence synthesis and being part of producing it. And they can also be involved in the governance of Cochrane, and I've shared a picture here of Cochrane's Consumer Network Executive, which is drawn from people right across the world. So the question then is why? Why should we involve healthcare consumers in research? And Cochrane in 2018 agreed this statement, a statement of principles for consumer involvement, and identified 3 ways that that they felt that it was important that consumers should be involved. I mean, the first one is that it's a civil society argument, really, that people should be involved as of right, and that is important because it makes research transparent and accountable, and increases the trust in research, which is, in the present COVID pandemic, more important than ever. The second reason was that it produces better evidence, and people believe that, and I think our presenters will point that out today, and that it reduces waste in research. It helps get that research into policy and practice, and ultimately leads to better outcomes for patients. And then the third reason is that it's expected of research these days. It's policy that patients are involved in producing it. It's expected by funders and partners and the public as well. So 3 powerful reasons really why consumers should be involved in research. Now, I'm just going to very quickly introduce the active framework, because I think you might find this interesting as a way of thinking about how patients, consumers can be involved in evidence synthesis. And it might find it an interesting way of thinking about this, about the presentations we hear from, about how far the active framework captures the experience we're going to hear about. So what we wanted to do was to find out different ways that involvement has happened in evidence synthesis, not just in Cochrane, but more broadly. We wanted to bring together the information that we gathered in that process, the materials that people had used, the results of some interviews that we undertook, and we wanted to make that available, and particularly we wanted to make that available as learning for people. We undertook a scoping review to find examples of the way that people had described their involvement. We conducted some interviews with participants, both researchers and patients, and then we developed a framework, which I'm going to describe to you, and from that we built our online learning resource. So the active framework, very briefly, captures a numbers of things to think about in the way that people are involved in evidence synthesis. We describe it at the ways that people can be involved at different stages of the cycle of evidence production, right from developing the question up to the point where it's published and people are trying to get that evidence into the hands of decision makers. So involvement can happen at all of these 12 stages of the life cycle of a review. We also thought about power in the way that patients, consumers are involved in research. And we developed this way of thinking about it. It's based on other people's work as well, but changed to capture the experience of involvement in evidence synthesis. So we thought that people could be involved in a wide range of ways, from receiving information to contributing, providing their views about their experience, to influencing the way that the review is done, that evidence is produced, to controlling it, right to leading it, where consumers can be the co-authors of reviews. We wanted to avoid saying that one form of involvement was better than another. We didn't have the evidence to say whether that was the case. I mean, you may have your own views about that, like I do, but in the framework, we didn't want to do that. And then on the left there, you can also see some of the different ways that consumers and patients can contribute, put into that framework. We also again looked at the different ways, different times at which people can be involved in co-producing evidence, co-producing reviews. And we discovered that this happens in a whole range of different ways, from involvement right the way through the process, from the beginning to the end, or perhaps involvement at one time, for example, in the development of the question. Or at different stages, perhaps two or more different places in that life cycle review, or some combination of those. So thinking about the time that people are involved. So that's a brief introduction to the active framework. And if you want to find out more about that, all of that is embedded in our Involving People learning resource. And I would urge the 60% of you who are on the call, who are interested in involving people, to have a look at this. It's a content-rich resource, freely available if you have a Cochrane account, which is also free. And it covers things like the essentials for good practice, for how to recruit, different methods for involving people, and when and how to involve people in that review. So that's enough from me. I think now we're going to get to the point that you'll probably most want to hear about, which is hearing from the people who've actually done this. And in the first instance, I'm going to hand over to Nick and Karen. If you'd like to begin your presentation, and I'll move your slides around for you.
Great, thanks, Richard. Yes, so I'm going to start with a little bit of a background on the review that we're doing, and then we'll talk about, me and Karen will share our experiences of it. So yeah, the title of the review is a little bit of a mouthful. So behavioural and cognitive behavioural therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So I think the motivation for the review came, pretty much directly from clinical practice. The lead author, Sarah Elliott, essentially she came to us as a review group, and she wanted to really understand what was the what effective interventions were out there to help her guide her practice. So I think that was, so we put together a team, obviously Karen and me, and Sarah's colleague, Jay Kumar, and also some systematic views from our Cochrane group. So yeah, could I go to the next slide? Oh, yeah. So essentially, yeah, where we've got to at the moment with the review is we've done screening, we've done research, well, research obviously first, and then data extraction, quality assessment. So we're at the writing up stage. That's where we've got. So it's quite a small review. It's just only one included study and possibly another one. Yeah, so essentially that's where we've got to. Go to the next slide. Okay, so I think the next couple of slides really we're going to do from like kind of researcher perspective and a consumer perspective from Karen, and we're going to look at kind of pre-post almost. So like, what did we think about before we did the review, and actually our sort of experiences during it. So obviously we came up with, what were our hopes of, including, why did we choose to have a consumer as one of the author team? Firstly, I think, the best reviews, I think, are multidisciplinary, where you have people who have expertise as researchers, expertise as clinicians, and also consumer expertise as well. I think the best reviews have all those leading into the review. And I think what we've tended to see in health research traditionally is almost a separation between the author team, which tend to be researchers and clinicians, and consumer involvement, which it's increasingly seen as important, but still almost often separate from the actual review team. And I think what we wanted to do is to try and reduce that gap. And I think generally, our view is that the closer that that gap gets closed, the better our reviews become, really, I think. And certainly our experience in the past is that there's a risk of, when you separate consumer involvement from the actual review team, there's a risk of tokenism. Certainly I've experienced that sometimes unintentionally in some of the reviews I've done in the past. I think that's something we really want to learn from and move on.
It's just a little hard to hear you, Nick.
Sorry, should I speak a bit loud? I'll speak a bit louder, sorry. So some of the, also want to talk about some of the kind of anxieties of, when you think about doing something new, including consumers as part of the author team. I think one of the key concerns, I think, for me was, can I provide enough support for Karen so that she feels she's not just being kind of left in the deep end? But also, as I talked about earlier, the review size, it was a very small review, just one study potentially. So it was a case of, well, will Karen think, well, am I able to actually contribute to it much? So I think that was something I was concerned about. And also inclusivity. So we were doing this review under the lockdown, so only meeting through Zoom, and also, in a multidisciplinary team, can we make those team meetings inclusive enough? And I think that was some of my key concerns. Shall I pass over to Karen?
Can we have the next slide? Good afternoon, everybody. I'd just like to add to Richard's introduction that I have contamination obsessive compulsive disorder, and this is the first time I've ever been a member of an author team. Nick's shown how committed he and Cochrane Common Mental Disorders are to including consumers in research, and he's also pointed out that it's not yet routine, which I think is a shame. And I was motivated by a burning conviction that consumer involvement is essential and really important in principle. We're the end users of the evidence. I think we have a moral right to be involved. We can help to make research useful and accessible, and we can promote its use at a time when evidence and science really need champions. So when Jess Hendon, the managing editor, invited me, I felt an obligation to step up and put my money where my mouth was. I knew some of the basics of the systematic review process in theory, but I wanted to learn more and see what they looked like in practice. And I wasn't certain, but I hoped that I might be useful in some way to the author team and to the consumers who'd read the review. My anxieties were, I am an absolute beginner, and I did worry how the team would approach my lack of experience and feel about it. I have imposter syndrome, and besides the social awkwardness, I was really worried that I might break something, so that I might be the person who misused the software and wiped out everybody's work. We have the next slide. Thank you. But I've discovered that researchers can have anxieties about working with consumers too. So I made this illustration of Nick and me feeling the fear of working together. Next one. So this is where we've got to so far. I think something to bear in mind is that consumers might not be well. And I had an OCD flare-up and I couldn't join the group at the beginning. I felt far too anxious. They were really understanding and they said that I could contribute whenever and in whatever way I wanted to. So when I felt better, I asked if I could join in with screening the abstracts. I'd had a bit of practice with Cochrane Crowd and the team was really helpful and they introduced me to the Covidence software. I didn't want to be thought a slacker since my name's on this thing. So unbeknown to Nick, I raced him. And I think I actually succeeded in doing one more than he did. Since we began with only 500 studies and then found another 2,500, I hope that the 800 I did were useful. I wasn't so confident about screening complete studies. I felt better able to contribute to the writing. So I commented on the background section of the protocol and I did some proofreading and they very kindly let me work in Word rather than in Review Manager, Revman. The lead author, Sarah Elliott, accepted all my suggestions and she also kindly answered all my irritating questions. And this made me disproportionately happy. I can't tell you what a tonic it was to have all those things accepted by Sarah. Because from the more than 3,000 studies, we only appear to have found about one that's eligible. There's less for me to do than usual, that's true. But this will make the discussion section interesting and I'm really looking forward to carrying on with this. Okay, next slide. Just going to talk about our reflections for the future and from my point of view, what went well. So the team's been marvelous, really kind, really friendly, and none of them had horns or fangs. I found it this positive and, as it turned out, not too onerous introduction to being a consumer author. It's been a fantastic learning opportunity. I've discovered some of the gaps in my understanding, and I'm going to go back to Cochrane's online training to see if I can fill them in. And I learned a lot about ASD and about my own condition too. And it's been so good to be involved in something positive at this time. I've truly valued the social interaction. Okay, next one.
All right, so hopefully, can you hear me okay? I think my microphone's a bit weak. Yeah, so I think from my perspective, what went well, I think certainly I really enjoyed working with Karen. I think, yeah, my worries about, will I be able to support enough? I think Karen was really proactive and, she knew her strengths. She also knew things that she wasn't too sure about as well. So I think that worked really well. The communication was, I think it worked really well, and I really enjoyed working with her. I like the balance of the team. I think really worked well as well. Clinicians, researchers, and consumers working together. I think is always great in theory, but actually I'm glad it actually worked in practice too. So I think that was great. And also, when I was talking about previously about worrying, is there just not enough to do in the review? But actually, in retrospect now, I can see that starting it with a small review where Karen has a chance to see, each step of the systematic review process. I think hopefully it's just provided a less pressured start and a good way to start being first time as an author.
Okay, from my point of view, what would have been even better if it could have happened? I wish I'd been well enough to join the team at the beginning and bond with them earlier. They knew so clearly what they were doing, and it was obviously routine for them, so I felt like a bit of an intruder at the start. I'd have liked to have known in more detail in advance about the process and the team's expectations of me. So something like this webinar, or perhaps some sort of induction, which needn't necessarily be formal, could have helped me. And it would be nice to have more quickly accessible online resources and tutorials for reference, for instance, about Covidence and RevMan, for those times when you need a reminder, which with me is daily. I want to go on learning now, and one time I'd love to be in the future, I'd love to be involved from an earlier stage, perhaps from the protocol stage. I think that would be really fascinating. Okay, next one. What would you say to other people thinking of trying this? I'd say to my fellow consumers, please don't hesitate, because we need you. Please jump in. It's interesting and worthwhile and satisfying to work on a team project with good people like Nick. And we need to advance our banner for consumer involvement. So come and join us. Nick.
And yeah, from a researcher's perspective as well, I think often we overthink things. I know I certainly do, in terms of, can this go wrong? Can that go wrong? I think often, what we worry about most of the time doesn't come true anyway. So essentially, I think having consumer authors makes the review better. So just give it a go.
And our final slide is just some thanks to the other members of our team and to people who've brought us together today and given us our soapbox. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Karen and Nick. And if you have questions for Karen and Nick, please do put them into the chat function. And we can try and pick those up at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Maureen and Janet.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to put up the name of the systematic review that we're going to be discussing. Next slide, please.
So thanks everybody for hosting us today and giving us the opportunity to connect with people. As everyone knows, and as Richard gave us such a great introduction there, Maureen and myself, we are calling in from Ottawa, which is in Canada. And as we're based in Ottawa, we will begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are hosting our call today is on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe nations. And the Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. So I'm making this statement to acknowledge that we're grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory and to be able to talk with you today, speak with you today from where we are. And this is a view from a park in Ottawa. So, but it's a lot whiter right now. Everything is covered in white because it's extremely snowy. So we'll have the next slide now, please, Richard.
Okay, so the purpose of our presentation today is to share our consumer and researcher partnership experiences, conducting a systematic review on decision coaching, and illustrate the ways in which researchers and consumers can collaborate.
Great, next slide. So the systematic review we conducted is a decision coaching systematic review. So it's about decision coaching. And decision coaching is a relational and non-directive support, a form of support delivered by trained healthcare providers to facilitate tailored progress in decision making and to guide people to prepare to actively participate in making a health decision. So essentially, it's a strategy to engage people to make decisions about their healthcare. And the objective of our systematic review was to determine the effectiveness of decision coaching provided by trained healthcare providers using non-directive supports to help patients participate in making health decisions. So next slide, please.
So this slide is to acknowledge the wonderful team that we worked with. So you'll see and hear the names of all of the people who were involved. Next slide.
So in our systematic review, we decided to use an integrated knowledge translation approach to conduct the systematic review. And here in Canada, we use the term integrated knowledge translation to describe a collaborative research approach conducted by and with knowledge users, or knowledge users are defined as people who will use or be impacted by their research. So for our systematic review, because we wanted to do this in a collaborative way, it was really important to have study governance led by a broad range of potential knowledge users. So that included healthcare consumers. So Maureen is one of the 2 consumers that was on the review, as well as healthcare providers, decision makers, and researchers. All of the team members had an interest in or were involved with decision coaching. So they brought that expertise to the conduct of the systematic review. And we engaged the team right at the very start. So we together identified the research questions, planned the systematic review. You just saw the citation for the published protocol. So all of the team members were part of developing the protocol, and we're also part of conducting the entire systematic review. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So this framework depicts how we set up our study governance as a partnership among an interprofessional and international team of members that included consumers. So we used what we called the collaborative research framework, and this is actually something, a descriptor of partnership research. Is something that actually I developed many years ago, actually initially in partnership with Indigenous partners. But I'm finding it's very useful with international non-Indigenous partnership strategies, and we used it in our study to conduct our Cochrane review, and it worked very well. So the study governance is negotiated really carefully among team members. So you can see that we invited team members, and so at the left part of the figure there, you can see that we worked to find common ground. So we built capacity among all team members. So it's not just building capacity in the partners in the research, it's building capacity in the researchers as well, because together we are always learning from each other, because everybody brought different forms of expertise, whether that was lived experience with the issues or that academic experience piece. So we organized ourselves and agreed on study governance. And here it shows an advisory board researcher collaboration. We just called ourselves the team. But we developed terms of reference and other sort of agreements so that we were clear on how we'd work together. Then we agreed on study ethics in the conduct of our review. So for example, we talked about how we would share knowledge within our group, how we would resolve disagreements, what roles people would take on publications and that sort of thing. And then for theoretical perspective, we had lots of discussions throughout the entire study with no assumption that everyone shares the same worldview. We knew that everybody brought their own understandings and their own worldviews to the study. And so, for example, with respect to terminology, we talked amongst ourselves about how to report appropriately on consumer or patient involvement in the review. And then we engaged this in the study using participatory methods and consensus building processes, and we co-developed the knowledge in the review process. So for example, we had regular email and online meetings. We ensured that all feedback was considered and engaged with. And before we started our work together, the study coordinator sent a survey out to each team member to ask what sort of involvement they wanted to have for each step of their review. And only the coordinator knew how each person responded. So we had this very safe way for people to indicate what level they wanted to be involved in. And so as we progressed through the review, the study coordinator would reach out to members and just to check and say, this is what you indicated you wanted to do. You wanted to lead or you wanted to advise. Please let us know if you still want to do that. And then they would be engaged in that step of the review. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So just presenting the researcher's perspective on consumer team involvement, we found that integrated KT approach, the collaborative approach, placed an emphasis on research relationships, and these were central to the research. And so it was the relationships piece was probably the most important part. We found that integrated KT accommodates the best practices and engagement and fosters agreements about ethical and equitable conduct in research. And we also built capacity in researchers and the process of conducting the work, as well as with consumers. And this led to findings that were more likely to be useful and able to be used in policy and practice. And then finally, there are many knowledge systems and ways of knowing, and our collaborative approach created a space for sharing these different ways of knowing within the research context. So it wasn't just the researchers' ways of knowing that was privileged in our review. And as a researcher, I cannot say how much we benefited from the collaboration with Maureen. So I'll stop talking there. Maureen, I'll pass it to you now.
Okay, thanks, Janet. So I'll give my perspective on the approach and the involvement. So at the onset, at the very beginning, there's two consumers involved. One was supposed to play more of a leading role. She was the more experienced consumer. I was the person who knew a lot about systematic reviews, but had never been a co-author in that role. And as you are aware, in working with consumers, sometimes life gets in the way and people have health issues. So I took the role of principal knowledge user. So that would be equivalent to being a co-principal investigator on the review. I have to say I was very nervous about that. But it was my role on the team was a process of discussion. So Janet and I met for the first time in a coffee shop, and she told me about the project and what they were thinking about doing. And I said right away, I don't want to be involved in literature searches and, extracting data extraction. I'm not really interested in that. And she said, oh, that's not a problem. I'd like to know, what are you interested in doing? So talk that through. And I said, but I'd like to sit in on all those meetings. I'm interested in learning about it. I'm interested in hearing about it, but I'm not interested in doing it. So that was very interesting. So I don't think I missed a single meeting. Our executive team met about every 2 weeks. And it was quite interesting because during those meetings, I would be quite quiet, but then they'd always have a question for me. So they'd find an area where, oh, let's get our perspective on that. So even though I thought that I couldn't really contribute to that area, I think that I did in a certain way, but that's because the team would ask me, questions. And then later, as I became more comfortable, sometimes I would just give my opinion. So, and in the other areas, I contributed, a great deal. And I knew that I was very comfortable in those areas. So the level can really vary in the different stages of the review. And I think researchers have to come prepared of what they're willing to support or able to support, but they have to negotiate with the consumer and have a discussion about what the consumer wants to do. So on the next slide, I'll show the active framework. I'll talk a little bit about that. So the enablers, the big enabler for me was that I had a connection with one of the PIs from the onset. So Janet made it clear to me that she was there to support me. She was there to answer my questions. So I didn't have to wait for a team meeting and then, maybe be embarrassed that I didn't understand this and have to ask in front of the other 4 people. And I could just, contact her and, get on the phone quickly or send a quick email and say, I don't understand this. And she would, right away give me an answer. That was really helpful. That was probably one of the best part. That was probably the biggest enabler for me. The other enabler is that when I did make a suggestion, it was welcome. So at one point I said, why don't we use the GRIP2 tool to report on patient involvement in the studies that we're looking at. Oh, great idea. So now the GRIP2 tool is going to be an appendix in the review. And then I said, oh, well, how about the project active framework? So every time I would make a suggestion, it was welcome. So then at the end of the study, near the end, when Janet said, well, we're going to do a realist review, I'm like, yeah, I put my hand up for that too. And that's because all the way through, they've built my capacity and they've given me confidence. And it's really important, you know, to have that. So much confidence that I saw another systematic review that's going to happen in my rare disease area on a topic that's directly related to me. And I was able to contact those authors and say, hey, how about including me on your author team? And they've never done that either. So the capacity building is really important. Next slide, please. Oh, there it is. Okay, so very quickly, I put the big purple arrows in the areas where I thought I was at the highest level of involvement, which is really, as you can see, quite a big part of the steps. It's not really a top and tail approach because I did participate in the meetings for all of the other stages, and I was more at a, you know, influencing level, but it's a continuous involvement. That was important for me. I needed to do that to really understand the whole process. That may not be important for another consumer. For me, it was important. And then you can see that I participated in all of the other areas, you know, where developing the question, plan the methods. Right now we're writing and publishing the protocol. Writing. Right now we're at the end. So we're actually writing and publishing the review. And then I plan to be involved with the knowledge translation and impact too. Next slide. So basically, I'm hoping that after having heard these two teams talk to you about our experiences, that our positive experiences have encouraged you to involve consumers in the as co-producers of systematic reviews. So hopefully you're ready for co-production. Thanks, Richard. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Maureen and Janet. Great presentations, and I'm sure people have lots of questions. I won't take up too much of your time now. I just wanted to say this, that there are lots of resources for both consumers and researchers to support your involvement. We have a consumer training collection with a whole wide range of webinars and other resources. We have our flagship Evidence Essentials that introduces people to evidence-based medicine, trials, systematic reviews. We have our Involving People resource, which I've mentioned before. There's a knowledge translation module, which is brand new. And we have Task Exchange. I see somebody's asking a question about recruitment. We have Task Exchange, which is an online volunteering platform commonly used for recruiting consumers to systematic reviews. You can find all of that learning on our website, which is consumers.cochrane.org. And then we have other contacts here. You can contact us by email, Twitter, Facebook. There's a training web page, and there's a Task Exchange link as well. I'll share these on Twitter and in other ways as well. It's a great cartoon at the end, I think. Patients and companies have unique knowledge. Very good. Right, that's it. I think we can go over now to the Q&A. Is that right, Nikita?
Yes, we've lots of questions, lots